Welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New School. Thank you for all of you for coming, and thank you to our panelists, our discussions, for assembling here tonight for this wonderful event, debating Bernie Sanders and the socialist future. And we are happy to have the sponsorship and support tonight of The Nation and Jacobin. My name is Julia Ott. I'm an assistant professor in history at the New School for Social Research, and I co-direct the Heilbroner Center for Capitalism Studies here at the New School. Let me begin by introducing our illustrious panelists here. To the left of me is Sarah Leonard. She's senior editor at The Nation and editor-at-large at Dissent. Bhaskar Sunkara is a founding editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine. And Bhaskar and Sarah just published The Future We Want, Radical Ideas for the New Century with Metropolitan Books. To my right is John Nichols. He's the author of numerous books, including The S Word, A Social History of an American Tradition, Socialism. Nichols writes for The Nation, The Progressive, and In These Times, among other publications. So welcome to all of you, and welcome to our panelists. A little round of applause. So I thought I'd begin tonight. We'll do a little time for discussion, and then we'll turn it over to you guys for some question and answer. I think we have someone with note cards. Is that correct? And so, be thinking of your questions, and the note cards will be coming around. So when we get to that segment of the evening, we'll be ready to go. But I thought I would begin by asking our panelists what the S word, socialism, what it means to them. So for each of you, Bhaskar, Sarah, John, what does that word mean in your work? And how did you come upon socialism in your work and in your writing? Sarah and Bhaskar, your title actually refers to radical ideas for the new century. And the essayists who you've collected together, they actually don't use the S word very much. But it seems to me that what they're talking about, that they all share a concern with how broadly and equitably to distribute both the fruits of our economy and also its burdens, and ways in which we can reduce and restrict the extent to which market-based thinking and market-based imperatives permeate and invade our lives and our political system. So that's sort of what I took socialism to mean for you and your authors, and I thought perhaps you'd like to expand on that, and again, how you kind of came to the concept in your work. John, you present in your book that socialism is an American tradition, and that's very important for you in terms of what you're trying to share with your reader. And I just wondered if there was a particular socialist or particular socialism in American history, because you go through, also kind of have a broad sense of it, and we learn about many different iterations in the book. But is there a particular socialist or particular moment in socialism that you find particularly relevant today? And why, would you argue, why does socialism matter, the history of socialism? Why does it matter today? So that's a lot, and we can begin however you like, yeah.
I almost feel like John should give us some history first.
That would be some good context, okay. So John, tell us why you think Americans need to recover this historical tradition, and what aspect of that tradition you think is the most meaningful for our moment.
Well, I'll be very quick and just tell you that the reason I wrote about socialism as an American tradition is because it's an American tradition. And in fact, it's deeply rooted in the American experience. Tom Paine, who wrote Common Sense and a number of other books in the American Revolution period and was well regarded for that, finished his canon by writing the book Agrarian Justice, which imagined a social welfare state. That book was accepted internationally as a model for social democracy. Even today, the Social Security Department or agency here in the US lists Paine's book, Agrarian Justice, as the beginning of the concept of Social Security. And so socialism didn't come from someplace else. It was rooted in an American experiment but in an internationalist American experiment, because Paine was someone who didn't just stop at the border of the US. He was active in France. He was active in support of revolutions all over the world. But one of the biggest mistakes that people make is to assume that somehow socialism is some idea that came from someplace else. There are great socialist traditions in other countries, no question of that. But the American socialist tradition is also great. And when we lose sight of that, we lose sight of why we've gotten so many things right over the years. The fact of the matter is America was founded, with an original sin, allowing human bondage, and pretty many other big original sins as well. But along the way, as we addressed these original sins and these original challenges, from the very earliest period of the United States, there were socialists and social democrats identified as such by the 1840s and 1850s, saying, no, this country has to be something different than what it is. But to answer your core question, is there a socialist that to me has relevance or has meaning? That's the answer to why I wrote the book, and it's the answer to most of what I do. I grew up in rural Wisconsin, and where I come from, socialism is a part of who we are. When I was a little boy, the mayor of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was Frank Zeidler, and he was a socialist. And he did not say he was for radical solutions that didn't use the word socialist. He was a socialist. He was really, really proud of that. And I knew Frank for the last 35 years of his life, for 40 years of his life, and he said that he spent his lifetime fighting for an equal distribution of the wealth, against war and militarism, for respect for the environment. And the best thing about Frank, who was a 3-term mayor of a major American city as a socialist during the McCarthy era, was that when he finished his mayoralty, they swore in a new mayor, and Frank, they had the ceremony and everything, and then there was a woman who went to the ceremony to see the transfer of power in Milwaukee, and then she went out to get on the bus. And as she was sitting to wait for the bus to come, Frank walked out with a box of stuff from his desk, and she looked at him and she said, "Mr. Mayor, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Socialists ride the bus."
Bhaskar and Sarah, what would you like to share with us about how you came to socialism and how you see that concept working in the new book?
In general, I try never to speak after John, so I'll take the bullet for Sarah. Well, I mean, I think, well, fundamentally, my vision of socialism is just, it's the extension of democracy from just the political realm into social and economic realms as well. So it acknowledges the way in which even the formal political democracy that we have today is stunted by capitalism, which ironically kind of makes possible, the abundance of capitalism makes possible a different sort of society, a society that embodies the French Revolution's slogan of, liberty, equality, and equality and fraternity. I kind of mix my languages, and it's made possible by the material abundance of capitalism, but its very structure and the structure of private ownership, which means that some people have the ability to, live a really free life under capitalism, and other people, their entire lives are spent in, working all day, and at best, that's the tyranny of 9 to 5. And socialists say if, political democracy is good, then why wouldn't also democracy in the workplace be good? Why wouldn't democracy in these other spheres be good? Why wouldn't democracy in the household, be good? So that to me is a fundamental premise. And these other things, you mentioned freedom from the market. That's also important, but it's more taking this logic further and saying that if even hardcore Tea Party Republicans believe that every child in America should be literate, right? They believe in some basic primary education. They might want to test that child every 2 months with high-stakes standardized testing or whatever else, but they still believe in that basic premise. So in a certain sense, as flawed as public education and how uneven it is in the United States, it's still decommodified, it's still taken from the market. Socialists would ask, okay, if that child has the right to read and write, then why wouldn't that child have the right to 3 meals a day or a roof over his or her head and things like that? So more and more spheres of life we want to see decommodified or taken out of the market. But what's key is the question of political power. In this case, it's the power of the working class to exert decisions over the things that influence their lives, and that could mean some place for a market. Even social democracy, much less socialism, people think of as kind of the opposite of the market, but there's been certain ways in which, let's say, the Swedish model of social democracy actually relied on the market more than other more capitalist systems. So I mean, that gets into the weeds, but I think fundamentally it's about democracy, and it's about power, and it's about thinking about ways in which we could actually have a society without class and without these power differentials.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question of expanding democracy, I think, is fundamental to why we wanted to do the book in the way that we did. And I will say, John, the reason that socialism is not on the cover of the book is when we conceived of this socialist project a little while ago, we did not think that was going to be its biggest selling point. But we could not have predicted what we are seeing right now. But we're happy to see it. So a sort of difference, people ask, how the project we're laying out is all that different from a liberal project or sort of left of center in America project. And something I tend to point to is liberal policy, liberal solutions tend to be geared towards questions of a certain type of equality, right? We talk a lot about equality. Liberal feminism, for example, I think is an easy answer. So liberal feminism says more or less, we women want to be equal to men. But as Bell Hooks and many others have pointed out, men themselves are not equal. Which men do we want to be equal to? And the answer, of course, is we don't think that anyone should be poor, right? We don't think anyone should be kept out of the classes that have access to the things that they need, right? So the difference is we are focused on a sort of redistribution of the resources overall, that any one piece of our social program requires redistribution in general. Something of note over the last several years, actually, is the ways in which inequality economically has actually fed into the political realm. And of course, I don't need to lay out all the ways that money is influencing this election, but there was a famous Princeton study that tried to measure, in the best social scientific ways, what sorts of influence average citizens and their institutions, like labor unions, had over policy outcomes, and what sorts of influence rich people and their institutions, like super PACs, had over policy outcomes. And the result of this study was that the influence of average people is negligible. It is negligible over policy outcomes. And so this is at a time of increasing inequality and at a time when many Americans have not really recovered from the recession if they were doing okay to begin with. And so you have tremendous building need, right? And at the same time, a government that is not at all responsive to that need, but rather responsive to something else. And this is a very combustible combination. And I think that's what we're seeing play out in this current election. And so for us, the only way to think about how we might expand democracy, whether it's in the political realm or the economic realm, is to think about serious questions of redistribution such that people have the resources, the education, and simply the time to engage in these processes. Socialism will involve some meetings, Democracy is not just like hanging out on your couch. You have to go do stuff. But right now, people don't even have time to do those things. You all know how hard it is to vote, right? Imagine trying to run more of society democratically. You can't be working 3 minimum wage jobs to make ends meet.
Well, I want to get back to the issue of time. I want to get back to the issue of many points that have been raised already, but we did promise our audience by entitling the session, with Bernie Sanders' name in it. I think we gave the impression that we'd spend some time talking about Bernie Sanders. So before people think that they're in the wrong room, maybe we'll go ahead and spend a little time right now. So Sarah mentioned in her comments that she did not expect that the word socialism would be a selling point, and so they left it off the cover of their book, and maybe their Metropolitan Books
is
rethinking that at this moment. A lot of people right now, perhaps even our esteemed panelists, would identify the Saunders phenomenon, and they look at his embrace of the term socialism, say that it was unexpected, and judge this to be a hopeful sign. That perhaps Americans, broadly speaking, large numbers of Americans, have grown tired, that they're fed up, that they're not buying it anymore. With the it being neoliberal capitalism of the last several decades, with all of the inequitable and pernicious effects that it has on average citizens' lives, some of which have already been mentioned. So I'm wondering if our panelists agree with that this signals, that Sanders' success signals a deeper dissatisfaction with contemporary capitalism than maybe we thought. But I'm also wondering what they make of Trump, if Trump doesn't maybe signal the same thing. Whether if there's dissatisfaction with contemporary neoliberal capitalism, and if they agree that it could kind of move in either direction, how do they sort of assess our current moment? In other words, it's sort of one thing to be very dissatisfied with current arrangements, and then another thing to move towards a more socially democratic or socialist future. Sure.
Well, it's certainly true, right, that people's increasing immiseration produces an interest in both further left and right-wing candidates. I mean, Trump is odious, of course, but he says a bunch of stuff that's true. I mean, not just about Ted Cruz's face, right? It's like, that's true, but there's also a lot of other... Yeah. I mean, we all wanted to say it.
Social scientists have done studies.
Right. So, but at the same time, when he says, the people in power are not listening to you, the people in power are lying, we all actually know that that's true, right? And so it's very appealing to have someone not bullshitting you. And when you look at the number of people, and we don't really know how many people, but many of us who have reported on the election have met them, who say they're either for Trump or Sanders, right? And what does that mean? Of course, to me, that sounds sort of nuts, like they represent two totally different things. But to people who feel like they're being lied to and made a fool of, and they would like someone to take their concerns seriously, it makes total sense to want to vote for one of two people who does not actually appear to be bought off by Wall Street, for example. And that is, in fact, true of both of them. So I think this sort of makes sense. I mean, the other thing to look to is I think there is a generational question wherein people roughly our age, if they did what they were told they were supposed to do and went to college, odds are they have a ton of debt, right? Average $35,000 of debt. For black students, it's actually much more. And so they did what they were supposed to do, and they got screwed. And they came out into a lousy job market. They've scrabbled to put things together. They're not living the dream they were sold. It sucks. And they feel like they've been let down. And I think further, we're looking at a political generation that was barely sentient in 1989 and perfectly sentient in 2008 when Wall Street crashed and may have lost homes, may have suffered in the job market, may have lost money. And so they're not afraid of Bernie Sanders. They're not afraid of a guy who calls himself a socialist. They're afraid of Wall Street. They're afraid of Hillary Clinton taking money from Wall Street. They're afraid of the Republicans who take money from Wall Street to some degree. And so I think there's a pretty clear thread through that sort of political coming-of-age moment, whether or not you were involved in something like Occupy, to a sort of openness and interest in someone like Sanders.
I was going to say, that's one kind of historical perspective, that generational perspective. I think that's really important. But going to John for a second, I was thinking about whether you might comment on this sort of Sanders and Trump thing from a historical perspective. I mean, when I look at it as a historian, I'm thinking of comparing, thinking about Sanders and this moment. There seems to me to be some sorts of analogies or affinities with FDR in 32. At least, the candidate who was presenting some capability for advancing a socially democratic kind of vision, although FDR certainly moved further along in that direction over time. But in the 1920s and in the 19-teens, we had this progressive era that even in the 1920s was, very vibrant still. The progressive movement was very vibrant still, and even the socialist movement at the local level, if not the federal level. We had preceding FDR in office Hoover, who we think of as this great conservative, but Hoover was the great engineer, the great social engineer. Wall Street hated Hoover. Hoover was very kind of skeptical about laissez-faire markets. So I'm kind of thinking about, wondering if you have some opinions about Sanders and with the historical comparison there, thinking about what has preceded Sanders, his in the run-up of the last couple of decades, his chances for success, either as a candidate or potentially as a president.
Well, at 74, Sanders has had a couple decades of doing this. It's important to remember that Bernie Sanders got elected mayor of Burlington, Vermont, 35 years ago as a Democratic Socialist. And as we like to say, an out Democratic Socialist. And he got elected to Congress as such 25 years ago, elected to the Senate a decade ago. So for those who, and Vermont, by the way, just to point out, in each of those federal races, for Congress, he beat a Republican. For the Senate, he was the first non-Republican elected to that seat since the founding of the Republican Party. So it's not like Bernie Sanders came along in, the Upper West Side of New York and succeeded in planting a Democratic Socialist flag. He did it in a place that in 1988, 2 years before he was elected to Congress, voted for George the Dad Bush for president. And so I think the important thing to understand is that Sanders has a long history of taking democratic socialism and inserting it into the political process as something that is, and I don't like this word at all, palatable, as something that is appealing. And I think that is only extended in the time that we've been in. But I don't think that Sanders is the right pivot point to think about. I think Sarah actually hit it when she talked about the 2008 economic meltdown. I think, I have to tell you, throughout the 1990s, I did a cable television show, which of course, many people have asked to have put on some sort of video so everyone could watch. But it was not the greatest show. But every week, the editor of a magazine asked me, what was the biggest story of the week? And I said the global revolt against capital. And this throughout the 90s. And unfortunately, it didn't fully, come to pass. But I was, constantly predicting that the moment would come. And I was just a little ahead of my time. But in 2008, we should understand what has happened since 2008. We have seen, not just in the United States, but around the world, a response to incredible corporate corruption, incredible banking corruption, the bailout of corporations and banks. So the thing is totally rigged. Right? There's no question of that. And whether Donald Trump says it or whether Bernie Sanders says it, it's a recognized reality. And so what have we seen in every country around the world? The rise of an anti-austerity movement. And in the United States, we have not had it so clearly defined as such, but that's what Occupy was at core, an anti-austerity movement with bigger ambitions. And that's what we're seeing play out at this point. If you just look at it in the context of Sanders, though, you make a big mistake, I think. Because all Sanders does is quantify for the pundit class something that I think most of us recognized. I think Bhaskar recognized it when they started Jacobin, that there was an openness to this. And Sarah, when she helped put together stuff on Occupy, that this was marketable. And it happened in 2011. I titled a book. I put socialism on my cover because I thought, man, this is going to sell. And one of the reasons that I did so was not this year, but in 2011. In 2011, there was polling that showed more than a third of young people were comfortable with the idea of socialism. And in fact, more young people polled as being comfortable with the idea of socialism than with the idea of capitalism. You also saw among African Americans, Latinos, and others much higher levels of openness to socialism and social democratic ideas than you ever heard about in our political discourse. So what Bernie Sanders has done this year is something that is necessary for the pundit class of America, which is somebody has to stand up and actually run for president and use the word. And then the pundit class of America goes, oh, hold it, something big has changed. It changed a long time before. And this is the last element I'll throw into this, is that what Sanders is doing this year, the most important thing that he's doing, aside from the politics, is that he's generalizing this word. He's making people comfortable with the word socialism. Now, that's important to understand that in the 30s, there was a high comfort level with it. Through much of the history of this country, there was a high comfort level of it. Franklin Roosevelt invited Norman Thomas, his socialist opponent, to the White House and said, and then came out and said, I just met with my good friend Norman Thomas, and he gave me a lot of ideas for things like, I don't know, Social Security. And so it's important to understand this word is now being brought back into the mix. It is being seen as acceptable, and this is how acceptable it has become. This is a big deal for where we go forward, because you have to get the word to an acceptable place so that then somebody doesn't accuse you when you argue for weatherization of windows of being a socialist. But this is how acceptable it has become. Brad Lander, is it the city councilman here? Is he councilman in Brooklyn, correct?
Yeah,
I'm a Wisconsin. So Brad Lander.
You know where Brooklyn is, come on.
Yeah, no, but he wrote this article the other day. It said, as a Brooklyn Democratic Socialist, I'm voting for Hillary Clinton. And supporters of Hillary Clinton were putting it on Facebook and tweeting it around and saying, see, we've got the socialists too. And so all I would tell you is, boy, if we have come to the point where both candidates for president of the United States are trying to, get the socialist vote, I think we've gotten someplace. And as for Donald Trump,
desired voting bloc.
Yeah, as for Donald Trump, I'm going to let Bosco take it.
Yeah, well, I would say one thing that that Sanders and Trump are both speaking to an anger, and it's purely anecdotal. But even 10 years ago, you would have a political discussion with someone. You would often find, or I would often find that people would actively defend the system. When I have conversations with those same people, it's not like they're ready to join us in the barricades and have the same exact worldview or anything like that, but they are upset at the system. But they're upset, but it's more like a dejection, and that a lot of people think, the system isn't working for them, but there's no alternative. And at the very least, I think that presents an opening for us. And I think Sanders is well to the left of FDR. In certain ways, I think he's to the left of Norman Thomas, if you adjust for the current moment that we're in. And I think the most radical thing that Sanders does is that with every speech, with everything he says, he creates polarization. He basically doesn't just say that, here's some nice things that we have. Here's some things they have in Sweden. Here's some things they have in Denmark, and it wouldn't be nice if we had it here. He says, here's some things we have, and here's why we don't have it. It's not for technical reasons. It's not because it's technically impossible. It's because it's politically impossible, and it's politically impossible at the moment because of the political resistance of a class of people, and he calls it the millionaire and the billionaire class. And that polarization is something that actually feeds into anger. So, I was up in New Hampshire, canvassing for Sanders. Not recently, before the New Hampshire primary.
It would have been a mistake to go recently.
I'm not wasting my time, yeah. And before the thing, I was with Jacobin's design director, Rumike Forbes, so we both are just like in this crowd, and we had some media come there and ask us questions. And we tried to lay low and pretend to be regular people and not people with a political stake in this campaign. And I gave kind of I'm for Bernie Sanders because I think we should have free public higher education, and I believe in universal health care and all these positive things. And maybe I made the error, maybe I didn't. Maybe I dropped in too much, Marxist jargon in the middle. But I'm pretty sure, I was being pretty safe. And I was put to shame when Sanders came on 20 minutes later, because Sanders not only focused on the things he was going to do, he created this polarization, and he named first names. So he wasn't just talking about, the Wall Street class or whatever. He went through and he named the CEO of Goldman Sachs. He went through and talked about the Walton family, and he was naming members of the Walton family, some of their first name, like Luke Walton, someone else, but Adam Walton or whatever. He was basically saying
that was Star Wars.
Luke Walton. No,
that was Star Wars with Luke, right? Wasn't it?
Assistant coach of the LA Lakers.
Oh, all right.
So John's from baseball country, America. We're from this is basketball America. But yeah, so I think that's really the radical thing about Sanders, and if you look demographically, I think he's better positioned than Trump. If you look at who his supporters are, if you look at how engaged they are, if you look at the fundraising operation he set up, these are all signs that there's actually a potential coalition of people who for the next 5-10 years are going to call themselves Sanders Democrats. I think they're younger and they're better positioned to actually influence the next decade or two of American politics. I think the most important thing is that we need to actually win some things. I think Fight for 15 and its recent victories, I think these things like all point, the emergence of social movements like Black Lives Matter, all these things point to movements that actually can demand things and win certain things, and I think that'll only embolden this coalition, because I think we just need to step away from the idea that just because the economic situation is getting worse, people are going to be more emboldened to do something, because I think the natural impact when things get worse is actually dejection. What will actually inspire people is that they see that collective action is a way that things get better.
So I think that leads pretty naturally into a question that I had about roadblocks and impediments that we may see in our current context, or we may see on this horizon, that may impede our ability to actualize or to realize a more radical or socialist future. And some of them came up in both of your books, so I just thought I'd give a couple that and to share them with the audience, and then we can comment or take up or discuss whatever you like. So there's the issue of localism, and sort of for various different reasons on both the left and the right, an aversion to the use of the federal government and social policy in sort of strong ways. There's the, of all the impediments, there's the nuclear family, something that came up quite a lot in Bhaskar and Sarah's book. There's liberal rights discourse. There's the financial system. There's money in politics. There is the hidden nature of the welfare state in the United States. There's red baiting. And then there are these deeper things, I think, long-standing, deep connections in the American political imagination between property ownership and democracy, democratic citizenship, and perhaps a sense, again, I think kind of long-standing, that liberty and equality are actually at odds with one another, quite to the contrary, not coupled in the way that we think of when we think of the French Revolution, but that rather, if you have equality, somebody's liberty must have been impeded. Somebody's ability to rise, somebody's ability to compete must have been hampered or redistributed in some way if you're going to wind up with an equality of outcome. So I wonder if our panelists would like to take up any of those impediments, either in the realm of belief or the realm of policy, or if they have other ideas about what some of our most pressing challenges might be in terms of realizing a more radical and socialist future.
I'm almost sort of scared now. I'm like, I don't know, maybe it's not possible.
Talk me out of it.
Yeah, just vote Hillary and hope for the best. So I'll take on like a little bit of that.
Well, I said the biggest. And maybe those are some impediments, but maybe some of them don't seem so small and insurmountable to you.
Maybe so. Well, okay. I'll start with one thing. So. One of the reasons we structured the book the way we did, and the way we set it up was as solutions in different spheres of social life, whether it's employment or gender or the environment from a socialist perspective, was first that we wanted to show that we did not just think of socialism as a sort of straight economic program, that of course that underlies every sphere of life. And we wanted to think creatively about how those spheres of life have evolved, how global warming changes how we think about the environment, how feminism changes how we think about gender roles, etc. And we want to embrace that in a socialist way. But second, we wanted to act as if we might be about to win something and sort of present a sort of confident program, which I think it's been a long time since socialists felt that they were in a place to do that. And then finally, as Bhaskar mentioned this earlier, we wanted to show that the impediments to fairly radical changes to American social policy were not impossible to do. they lacked political will currently. So we hear a lot in the debate, and especially in the Democratic primary, how could Bernie Sanders be for single-payer health care? He's just going to rip up Obamacare. It's really impractical, and he's going to screw you all over in the end. And we're like, okay. Well, if you look at any country that has this type of health care, it's very doable. We actually know how to do it. It's not hard, practically speaking. And we've had many people go before us and set an example. And in fact, when I was talking to the nurses union about Bernie Sanders, they've endorsed him, they immediately cite, of course, one of their reasons for endorsing him as single-payer universal healthcare. They want it so badly. And these are the most practical people about healthcare you can conceivably imagine. These are the people who are handling what happens when people come into the emergency room and their first question is, how am I going to pay for this? So we wanted to show that that the obstacles actually are not practical ones of implementation, that rather they're political. So I guess that's sort of the first thing, and a big project we had with the book. And maybe, I don't know, I'm not going to try to answer all of them. Maybe I'll turn it over. Yeah,
I guess there are some impediments. For instance, the United States was founded to make sure that this didn't happen. And I won't do it today because we don't have time, but often when doing talks, I make everybody in the room stand up. And then I ask all the women to sit down. And then I ask all the people of color to sit down. Then I ask all the religious dissenters to sit down. And then there's still a few guys standing up. And then I said, would anybody who's not a large wealthy landed property owner sit down? At that point, usually the room is all sitting. And I say, look around. Everybody who's standing is who had a right to vote at the founding of this country. The fact is, this country was not established as some sort of wide open, freewheeling democracy where people got what they wanted. This country was established with a very, very constricted democracy, and that constricted democracy extends to this day. The fact of the matter is, I can't imagine how hard it is to vote in New York State. I mean, it's beyond my comprehension. I come from Wisconsin, a little formerly progressive state out in the Midwest, and even after 5 years of Scott Walker's retrograde right-wing march backward, you can still register to vote on election day. And it's an open primary, so you don't have to be a member of a party. You just go vote. And amazingly enough, in that setting, Bernie Sanders got 57% of the vote. But most of this country has incredible barriers to democracy. And I would argue that those are also barriers to social democracy and to economic democracy. And so as we talk about how to get where we want to get, we should be conscious of the fact that we've got to bust through those barriers. The first one is we need a universal right to vote and a right to have our vote counted. This is not a complicated concept. It should be in our Constitution. It should be absolutely guaranteed. We shouldn't have to wait for a good Congress to give us a little bit of a Voting Rights Act. Number two, we should have a constitutional amendment that absolutely bans. Remember, the founders started with constitutional amendments, so I think we can too. We should have a constitutional amendment that absolutely bans corporate money and big money in politics. We should say we have a right to organize elections where our votes matter more than their dollars, and that money is not speech and corporations are not people. Simple concept. And then, frankly, I'd probably get rid of the Electoral College and gerrymandering and a couple other things, and we're well down the track. But I'm not kidding about this. If you really are serious about this, you must recognize that throughout the history of this country, socialists have been democracy advocates, militant democracy advocates. And then the second thing, and this is the only bottom part of it, is I just happen to think we have a really lousy media in this country. And we have a media in this country that literally is the last to know. Not the last to know as regards inside the meetings where people gather and sit around, but what they put on television, especially in television news, it's the last to know. It's after everything else has happened. And then years later, they actually figure out, well, you know what? It turns out the Vietnam War maybe wasn't that good an idea. No, there were people at the time who knew it wasn't a good idea. And so we have a media system in this country that is constantly trying to turn us all into pundits. And trust me, I'm a pundit, so I know this. And this is a big deal. They actually want, what do they put up first? The polls. And the point of a poll is to tell you that what you want, you can't get. And then they tell you, then they actually project into the future. They say, you know, 6 months from now, all the stuff you believe in is going to fall apart and not succeed. So maybe you should just stop now. And you know, again and again, we have a sort of a message from our media that is dream less, be less bold, you know, give up. Now we're breaking some of that with social media. We're beginning to open some of this up, but don't live in the fantasy that social media is going to get you there. Wealth and power has colonized every media platform it's had a chance to get at, and they, through net neutrality fights and others, they are trying to colonize social media as well. And so the bottom line is this: you people are the essential core of everything good that will come of this country, because you came out on a Monday night and you didn't go to the rally in Queens, and you came and you found the elevator and you came up to the 5th floor and you packed into this room to talk about social democracy and how you actually get there, or socialism, or whatever frame. And this is the critical thing. We literally are going to have to go out and talk to our neighbors and knock on doors and build something that goes beyond and around our existing media, which is a disaster, and goes up that ladder to reform our democracy. That is a part of this whole thing. The alternative is something, you know, that gets us much more toward a violence and toward things that frankly I don't want. I want us to have peaceful change. I'm a Quaker. But I will tell you that we have to get busy on this, because the changes that are coming toward this country are radical and overwhelming, especially with automation of our workplaces, with the digital revolution that's going on. And so we've got to get ahead of the curve. The left can't be waiting any longer. The left needs to be pushing hard for something that is far more radical, and something that's frankly outlined in this book. And you'll wonder why I am going on about this. Because amazingly enough, in one of my many jobs, I go on television now and again. And tonight, on the eve of the New York primary, I have to go and do Chris Hayes' show. And my job is to talk about the fight for the Democratic Party, this struggle to define what the Democratic Party is. And so I have to leave you early, and I'm deeply apologetic for that. I'm going to steal Bhaskar's term, Bernie Sanders Democrats, and try to insert...
Just Sanders Democrats.
Sanders Democrats, forget that. And suggest that I was on a panel tonight with a guy who was talking about this new entity, Sanders Democrats, and try and, you know, hopefully expand this discussion a little bit more. So I have to leave, which I really hate, because I love you and I love being with you guys. No, I really do. And I love talking about socialism and social democracy. But I want to leave with this one note. You're going to hear a lot more from these folks, and you'll get to ask them some great questions. I think the book that Bhaskar and Sarah have done is more than just a good book that you should all get, and it's even more than the fine holiday gift that I think we all know it is.
What holiday?
I don't know, Election Day. Yeah, which should be a holiday named Democracy. No, the book that they have done, I think, is a pivot point book. I think this is a book that really does outline ideas that will become central to our discourse in the years to come. Not the many years to come, the short amount of time to come. And I commend it to you at the highest level as somebody who has literally read every socialist book that's come out since Agrarian Justice. And this is a big deal book. It's a really important one. And I hope that you will not just buy it, but also share it with your friends. This is the stuff of discussion groups. This is the stuff of really forming movements. And I'm tremendously honored to have been on a panel with Sarah and with Bhaskar, and also to have been with you tonight. You're wonderful people. Thank you for coming out.
Well, that is a beautiful transition into our participatory part of the evening. As
the more
John,
democratic
the
part
more
of the
democratic
evening.
part of the evening, exactly. So I am. Have we collected notes? Okay, great. Fantastic. Hopefully, I'll be able to read these. Okay, because I'm wearing my contacts, which is never the best for me. Okay, Bhaskar and Sarah. Is Sanders giving new life to the Democratic Party? Will the Sanders Democrats make it more possible or less possible for for there to be a meaningful left party in the United States? Bhaskar, this is probably a good one for you, since you've coined the phrase.
Right. So I think that, for one thing, I think history has shown that the Democratic Party is structured in such a way that actually makes it almost impossible to actually turn it into a coherently even social democratic or labor party. In much more favorable conditions in the 1960s and 70s, on the backs of more powerful movements we have now, with very talented people involved, major attempts to realign the party failed. Or they failed, and they failed to some extent. There was real gains of the New Politics movement. There's a reason why kind of the Dixiecrats were gone, but even at this point, it still was unable to turn the Democratic Party into what these reformers wanted to turn the Democratic Party in, which is a social democratic party rooted in an organized working class like the parties in Europe. And I think there's certain structural reasons that will make it very difficult. That being said, if you don't have kind of this emergence of people who support Bernie Sanders trying to do it within the party, if no one's actually attempting this, what I think is pretty much a doomed pursuit, then what chance do you have to build something outside the party? So I think the thing that will happen next, and the growth of any possible left party in the United States, will happen by a combination of some people working with inside the party, some people working outside. I personally believe, and this is just me as a terrible ultra-leftist, that the people working inside the party are going to run into tremendous barriers, and their struggle won't be successful. But I think that process of radicalization is the only way that things are going to happen outside anyway. And much the same way as why I think Bernie Sanders is just supporting this wider project inside and outside the party is basically because, I honestly don't think that social democracy is enough. I think that we've seen social democracy, even at its peak, even at its best, be insufficient to I think the standards of freedom and justice that we should expect from a social system. That being said, if you can't win a majority in a country for social democracy, how are you going to win a majority for anything more radical than that? So I think Sanders is a first step, but it has to be a certain type of social democracy or social democratic movement for the left to have any meaningful voice in this. It has to be kind of a social democracy from below, a kind of a class struggle social democracy like Sanders is proposing, where there is enemies and we are combating and fighting people to win things. It can't be a system that's just kind of imposed from above to try to salvage capitalism in some form.
Okay, I've got a tough one. This is a great question. What is the socialist position on the gun debate?
Sure. I don't think there's a long, elaborate answer to that. I think there are a couple of types. One is there's a Bernie Sanders question there, which is just, did he do the wrong thing by not being tough enough on guns? As a representative of Vermont, I would say, yes, that was bad. It's not shocking, given the way that Vermont tilts. And I think the overwhelming evidence in this country, of course, is that what guns do is largely kill a large number of innocent people every year. We're against that. There should be gun control. And should the left decide to take up arms tomorrow, I think I know who would win.
I would say I'm not necessarily for, well, the thing is, I'm not for gun control like it's being offered by the Clintons or actually most politicians. I'm not opposed to the idea. I wish it was a more viable strategy for us to form worker militias and so on. But even the strategies that worked in the 30s, which was all, self-defense against employer violence and employer militias and so on, or even the, very symbolic use of guns by the Black Panther Party and so on. I thought those are actually, largely obsolete strategy. It's not, a winning strategy. That being said, there's very highly armed societies that are not as violent and terrible in that respect as the United States. And I think if we were to push for a left-wing gun control, it would be based on things like, I haven't actually thought through this idea, but things like, disarming patrol police as you're disarming, populations and, and so on. So you're connecting, in this case, two struggles, once against police violence with one against broader, violence and crime.
Right.
But also like things like gun manufacturers, like going after gun manufacturers and making them pay. And I think that's a real fault of Sanders' gun control stance, and that he kind of is taking this very libertarian stance that I think does make sense at an intellectual level, but that essentially allows him to defend certain aspects of gun manufacturers, where I think we should be fighting against gun manufacturers, not just for what they do in the country, but because of the way U.S. arms are exported all over the world and are responsible for many more deaths than happen in the United States. So I think if gun control means fighting against gun manufacturers, then I'm for it. But if it's what it is now, I'm against it.
Yeah, I'm still for gun control as it exists now. However, it seems pretty clear that disarmament of police on a heavy level would certainly be important and, in fact, fundamental. And we've seen the way that police departments now roll out tanks. And so there's no way, of course, to engage even in what would be peaceful protest with that level of arms on the other side. It's obviously insane. And I would also distinguish between there's the question of gun control, and then given a situation in which we do not have gun control, the ways in which left-wing groups might take advantage of that situation to make a political point. So the Black Panthers are the classic example of this, right? It turns out when black men start walking around with legal arms, people are not as comfortable with it as when you have groups of white men doing that. And so there are ways in which this can function as part of a political strategy, whether that's in talking about how we should regulate guns in this country, or more likely, who is actually in need of self-defense, who's in need of protection, and what does this say about who we think is, has the right to be armed and who doesn't, who is allowed to force things on people and who is not. So I think that type of political point can be made, but certainly gun control, I think, is important in this country.
With capitalism often seen as the only viable way, it often feels like when people feel oppressed in the workforce, public sphere, etc., they don't know how to take real action in their communities. How does one begin to take steps on an individual level towards a socialism that isn't just utopian thinking?
That's an awesome question. Well, this is actually something the Sanders campaign has made easier, is that there are now groups of people meeting as socialists on a much larger scale, and they're not that hard to find. And I would seek them out. I would use the internet to seek them out. I mean, in joking aside, in most communities at this point, there's the Facebook group for Bernie, whatever, go meet those people. And begin to get involved. But once the campaign is over, that's the much more interesting question. Now that you know a bunch of other like-minded people, what do you do? My answer for this has been that if you look at the way the left is structured now, there are a lot of divides, right? So racism on the left, fundamental dividing line over the entire history of the left, although it has changed and evolved. And in many ways, the sort of racial consciousness of left-wing worker movements over the last century used to be better. But if you are a man, for example, and don't understand why some women are sympathetic to Hillary and think that they're just stupid, maybe you should be more involved in women's issues and get some education and go and support women on the left, which is not to say you should go vote Hillary because some women are, but rather to begin thinking, okay, so we have all this sort of media talk, at least, about the idea of Bernie bros, right? This is something that has been occupying a disproportionate amount of my thought. And the fact is, the left is no more sexist than any other part of society. We're just part of a sexist society, right? So is there sexism on the left? Certainly, yes. But what if the left was the part of the political spectrum where no one yelled at women? That would be great. And I think it would win a lot of other people over to our side. So my point is, if you're looking for ways to get involved after the election, think about, where am I building alliances? How am I making the left stronger by serving people who are not like me? How am I building coalitions? And then, from there, that's very abstract, of course. What does my community need? Get involved in your community. If you're in a union, get involved in running that union. Be involved in the process. Learn what your union is like. Some unions are more left-wing than others. If you're in one that has a strong social justice component, take part in those initiatives. If you're not, think about why not. See if you can push. If your community has a problem with housing segregation, gentrification, get involved in that. You know, in New York, certainly, anywhere you might live has community groups, has tenant councils. Certainly Brooklyn has seen an upsurge in actually active tenants unions. And those are very, very good organizations to go get involved with. And the idea is that you're building these coalitions and you're doing this left-wing work so that socialism becomes responsive to people's actual needs, and so that you are learning what people need and how you relate to these problems as a socialist. And you can, there's nothing, this education or this sort of election period has been also an educational period. What does it mean to think about questions in a socialist way? And so you bring that to the problems that you're facing in your community.
It sounds like you guys may have a topic for your second book of essays, how to be an actually existing socialist.
That's where we solve all the problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bhaskar.
I was just going to make a joke that's kind of rough for word choice. Stalinist? No. Actually existing socialism.
The Stalin jokes still don't play.
I know. When I'm hanging out with my older socialists, audience, when I'm down in Florida doing talks or whatever, it kills.
Down in Florida.
But one thing that I would quickly disagree with the questioner is just I think people know what to do. I think people know that their situation is not good, and if they could, they would fight back. I think often we should think of it like, because the left is so weak in the United States, because the labor movement is so weak, and the segments that are, I was a member of DC 37, for example, for like 3.5 years. It's like a terrible union. It's like probably worse than being any union, maybe. The drug benefits were okay though, so I think often, if you are in this situation with a weak left and a weak labor movement, that collective action isn't actually a viable choice. If you're facing hardship at a job and you know that you're in a situation with high unemployment and this weak movements, then it makes sense to keep your head down, try to keep your job, then ask your friends or family or other kinship networks for any help, or maybe get a personal line of credit or whatever. So I look around and I see the current situation, which is, yes, some more fight back than before, but still not a lot of it. And I see people being rational. But what you see now, even something like the Bernie Sanders campaign, the reason why CWA decided to do their strike, last week was timed with this upsurge and this people that were involved in fighting. So if you give people openings, then they'll really be able to do it. So our job in the left, I think, is just to create kind of the infrastructure and to try to build movements to the point that collective action is actually a viable choice for people today.
It sounds like a very important first step is just recognizing the capacity or the ability to find collectivities and sites of solidarity in your own life.
Yeah, and actually this is just a small point, but something that killed me during Occupy, actually, which was a mess of a moment. I mean, this was not in a left institution building. Was that the commentators would always say, these kids are so disorganized, it's such a mess, what's wrong with them, why are they having these weird councils where they shout at each other? And I got where they were coming from because it looked very chaotic, but this was a group of young people who had basically no chance of ever having been in an institution on the left that would have taught them how to organize themselves, right? Like basically none. We have 11% unionization in this country, and so a young person then would not have been in one and most likely will never be in one. And so the sort of training sites of the left don't exist right now. They've been declining since the late 70s. So I think the sort of strong criticism that there aren't institutions for people to feed into is totally true. And I also think it's important to understand why that's the case, the assault on unions and so forth. And so we are in a period of building those institutions. And I think anyone who gets involved now is taking part in that process. But it is a little messy. Like, there's not a straight, pat answer. It's not like join the party, right?
Which is worse for a socialist left, a Clinton presidency or a Trump presidency?
I thought it was being Clinton or Sanders,
Yeah,
which is a more complex question.
Well, maybe we could put all three of them in the mix there.
I think without a doubt, Trump is worse. And I say this as someone who, I will not. I have the privilege of being in New York, so maybe I have to think about it a little bit less. But I won't vote for Hillary Clinton. But I think without a doubt, you have to think of it not just policy, which I think in that case Trump is actually worse on almost every policy. Maybe you could say trade or whatever. You could pick the difference. But social forces, who elected you and who backed you, and I think. There's, I think there's really no comparison. It's a no-brainer for the left. And beyond that, I think we need to break away from the idea of kind of this vulture theory of socialism that, the worse it gets, the better. If there's a Trump presidency, movements will be demoralized and battered and will be in even worse shape. Let's hope for a none of the all above. Yeah, none of the above and, Sanders in the White House. If only, even if he can't get much done, I think there's this old, whatever, I won't get into it, but sometimes you need to occupy power even if you can't do much about it because you should deny power to more reactionary parts of society. And I think at the very least, Sanders' presidency would do that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I think it's simply clear that if we, for example, have to spend 4 years fighting for the right to even have an abortion, for example, we are going to be not occupied with making progress. We've seen this over many, many years. I don't have to remind anyone of what it felt like under George W. Bush, where you were constantly fighting for scraps of civility and defending basic human rights. It's not productive. It's not a way for us to make progress. And also, frankly, having someone in power who is articulating certain things that we agree with, like Hillary Clinton will get up there and say, there should be greater equality, is very productive because you can point to hypocrisy.
Yes. This is a great question. We just had a talk in the history department tonight by a young author named Josh Clark Davis. I'll give he's writing a book on From Head Shops to Whole Foods about countercultural businesses. So this relates to his talk earlier this evening. Do you believe worker cooperatives or any kind of cooperative enterprise belong this more to the socialist tradition or the capitalist tradition?
Well, I think they can belong to either. I mean, actually, Franco, for example, helped start and was okay with worker cooperatives in certain regions and certain areas. And in other cases, you've seen actually capitalist states and capitalists use worker cooperatives partially because of the fact that these are workers that are no longer unionized and subject to the same labor law. So, because they're shareholders in a small company, so sometimes it was easier to contract out work and exploit workers that way. Obviously, you also have seen cooperatives emerge in truly revolutionary contexts or even just general progressive contexts. So I think it depends on the broader political movement that's pushing them. It depends on kind of the balance of forces in a country at any particular moment. So I think it belongs to both traditions, but we should be aware of kind of the limits of cooperatives that are competing against each other in the market. While also saying that in a certain way, with the right ethos, with the right movement behind it, cooperatives can be an example for people of, here's actually how functioning workplace democracy looks like. And I think generally, cooperatives should be a part of our movement. We shouldn't see that to the right, but there's not that much, I think, inherently socialist about cooperatives in the abstract.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add there's actually an essay in the book that talks about small businesses very critically. And the example that the author takes is there's a lovely bookstore on the Upper West Side, charming, very intellectual, small business, and the owner talks about himself a lot as a small business owner, but he will not let his employees unionize. And he has fought them tooth and nail. He screws them on benefits, and it's terrible. And so this is a smaller, more communal workplace, but it's not better. And in fact, in a larger workplace, if it were unionized, you'd be much happier. And in fact, you would have more democratic control over your workplace because you'd have some measure of power. And so this is a little different from a cooperative, but this is where the question of scale is not necessarily the determining factor. And the author goes on to talk a little bit about cooperatives themselves. I think it's also important to be experimenting with that type of social organization because it can in fact be useful for communities that need to self-determine now. And so you see this more in the South, for example. There have been some really interesting cooperative experiments, largely by African-American communities that want to step outside of economic relationships that they find to be exploitive. And I will say further, when I was in Greece and looking at how people were surviving under austerity, where austerity is extremely dire and is already cutting back on medical care, on food, people are homeless, it's really bad. Who stepped into the void? It was all these leftists who had been working on organizing cooperatives for years. And they were like the crazy leftists, right? Like, who wants to talk to them about their weird cooperative experiments? And they were just shocked. They're like, wow, this really came in handy. And they've organized very serious networks that are moving food from the country to the community-run grocery stores, that are distributing it, that are doing actually a Greek version of the breakfast program. And this has been actually fundamental to the left's survival. So this isn't exactly what we maybe need on a broad scale right now, so it's very culturally and politically contingent, but I wouldn't write those things out of sort of significance for a larger socialist movement that maybe wants to operate on a large scale as well.
So I want to make sure we have enough time for you all to meet the authors and have an opportunity to purchase and get a signing of their marvelous book. But so I've kind of picked one last question. Is Bernie Sanders a socialist?
I care so little about this question.
Well, let me ask
I do care. I care.
That's so mean. Don't worry, that person's probably not in the room anymore. They probably left. It's one of those two people.
Well, let me do a little follow-up that sort of encapsulates some of the other questions. Is Bernie Sanders a socialist? And would he actually, if elected to president, get anything sort of socialist accomplished when we think about the...
Let me answer this because I have to atone for having said I don't care about that question. I do care about that question. I don't care about it when it's asked by... I think there's a sort of pundit version of that question, which is like, oh, you silly people, don't you know he's not actually what you think he is? And that drives me crazy. And I think it's so cynical and insidious. I'm going to guess that whoever asked the question in this room is not a CNN pundit. So given that, is Bernie Sanders a socialist? No.
Could he be a socialist president? Maybe would be.
Oh, no one could be a socialist president right now. For the simple reason that we are not strong enough on the left to back up someone trying to push socialist programs. Are we stronger currently than the corporate influence on Congress? No. So we're not there yet. There is no possible way that we could have a fully socialist presidency right now. But what that doesn't take account of is the catalyst that Sanders has been in getting more people organized towards the goal of the stronger left that would make a socialist presidency possible. And so this is absolutely important and fundamental, and an actual catalyst towards something that would look like real socialism if we can get it. And so I think he's very important in that way. And so to parse the ways in which he is or is not exactly a socialist, I think is usually, at least in the media, a way of distracting from his part in the way that social change is actually created.
I think without a doubt, Bernie Sanders is a socialist. And if any of you have been in the socialist movement or talked with socialists, you know that we argue a lot amongst each other. That doesn't mean that Bernie Sanders subscribes to the same exact vision of socialism that I do or Sarah does, but that doesn't mean he's not a socialist. I mean, this is someone who joined YPSL in the late 1950s, and that was the start of his career as a socialist. And then he was active in the civil rights movements and other movements throughout the 60s. he was active throughout the 70s and 80s. He recorded a Folkways record collection of him saying, reciting speeches by Eugene Debs. So I've actually I have this record, and I haven't like told many people about it or got it out because I'm just like maybe like I don't want the right or the Clintonites to pick up on it.
There's also the one where he sings.
Yeah, oh, this one he's more just like a lyrical speeches, but he's reciting Debs, so he's like,
sounds great.
Eugene Debs. He's introducing one. Eugene Debs knew that as a proletarian revolutionist, he could not support a capitalist government and a capitalist government's war. I'm like, damn straight, Bernie Sanders. No drones over Syria and Pakistan. So yeah, I think he comes from our tradition, and you see it. You still hear it in the fact that he could give a 2-minute stump speech because he has a worldview, and he has a worldview with enemies of progress and with the social forces that he think can bring about progress. And any socialist has that polarization. So he's far from a liberal in his worldview, and you hear it in his speeches. And I really do think that's the reason why he's gotten this much success. It was partially because socialists can actually speak to this reality that people see. Often we don't do a very good job at it. But I think if you try to compare Bernie Sanders' worldview and his ability to articulate things with, let's say, an Obama-type politician, a Clinton-type politician, there's more clarity in Sanders. And that's why, these wonk class really hates Sanders, because they want policy details in every speech. That's not what speeches are about. Because, if even as they would admit, they couldn't pass Obamacare today that they passed in 2008, well, we probably can't pass single payer either. But which one's actually going to change the conditions in which people are writing policy in 2, 3, 4 years? Is it kind of this Clintonite triangulation language, or is it a language of being, straightforward and actually, reflecting the kind of the anger people are feeling and a coherent worldview? And I think Sanders, as a socialist, offers us all that. And that's so. I think without a doubt he's a socialist.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thank you to John Nichols and Sarah Leonard and Bhaskar Sundara for helping us think through tonight the future that we want. And please check it out at the book table and meet our authors now for a signing.